The attorney's name was Gerald Foss. He had gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of careful voice that never rises above a certain volume, no matter what he is saying. He had been Grandpa Harold's estate attorney for 22 years. I knew that because Grandpa told me. He told me a lot of things in the last 2 years of his life, things he hadn't told anyone else, things he said out loud in the specific way of someone who wants to make sure at least one person in the world understands clearly. Gerald Foss sat at the head of a conference table on a Thursday morning in April and opened a manila folder. My parents were seated to my left. My Uncle Dennis and his wife Patris were seated across from them. I was at the far end of the table with my hands folded in my lap and a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. My parents thought they knew what the folder contained. They had spent 2 years making sure they knew. Gerald read the standard language first, the recitation of name and date and mental soundness and intent. My mother arranged her face into something soft and patient. My father rested one hand flat on the table, the way he does when he is trying to appear calm while his mind is already 3 steps ahead. Gerald read the primary document. He set it aside. He cleared his throat once, quietly, and reached back into the folder. "There is also," he said, "a codicil." My mother's hand went to her chest. I had been waiting 8 months for that sentence. I took a sip of my coffee and said nothing. Before I tell you what was in the codicil, I need to tell you who my grandfather was, because it matters to understand what he did and why he did it the way he did. Harold Caldwell was born in 1941 in a small town in western Pennsylvania. He was the third of 4 children. His father worked in a steel mill. His mother kept the household and grew a garden large enough to feed the family through every winter she could remember. Grandpa grew up understanding that money was a tool and that tools had to be earned before they could be used. He worked his first job at 14, a summer position loading trucks at a lumber yard. He worked every summer after that and saved every dollar that didn't go directly back into the house. He served 2 years in the Army. He came back, married my grandmother Ruth in 1964, and used the money he'd saved to buy a small residential cleaning company that someone else was selling for reasons Grandpa always described as a failure of patience. He ran that company for 31 years. When he sold it in 1995, he was 64 years old and the company had grown from 4 employees to 47. He had built something from almost nothing, and he knew what that process required, and he never forgot it. Grandma Ruth died in 2006. That was the year I turned 12. I remember the year clearly because it was the year everything in our extended family shifted slightly, the way a house shifts when one of its load-bearing walls changes. Grandma had been the social calendar. She was the one who organized Christmas and remembered birthdays and made sure everyone showed up. Without her, the family had to learn to organize itself, and not everyone managed that equally well. Grandpa managed it better than anyone expected. He kept the house. He kept the garden, though smaller now. He learned to cook in a way he'd never had reason to before. He drove himself to the grocery store every Tuesday morning and to church every Sunday and to his monthly breakfast with 2 friends from the Army who were still living. He was, by any measure, a man who knew how to be alone without being lost. My parents lived 40 minutes away. My Uncle Dennis lived 20 minutes from Grandpa in the opposite direction. My father and Dennis were Grandpa's 2 sons. There had been a daughter, my Aunt Joanna, but she died young, before I was born, and Grandpa carried that quietly the way some people carry things that are too heavy to ever put down completely. I was Grandpa's only granddaughter. I don't say that to position myself as special. I say it because it was a fact that mattered to him in ways he expressed rarely and showed constantly. In the way he asked about my school projects when no one else remembered to ask. In the way he saved newspaper clippings about things I'd mentioned being interested in. In the way he called on Tuesday evenings, because he knew Tuesday evenings were usually when I had finished whatever I needed to finish and had time to talk. We talked, my grandfather and I, in the specific easy way of 2 people who have decided to actually listen to each other. Harold Caldwell did not talk about money the way some people do, as a subject, as a status marker, as something to be discussed openly and often. He talked about it the way he talked about structure, as something that existed behind everything visible, something worth understanding because it determined what was possible. I learned this slowly, over years of Tuesday evenings. He would tell me things in the middle of other conversations, the way you slide a piece of furniture into place while talking about something else, and then step back and see that it fits exactly where it needed to go. Once, when I was 20, he told me that the single most valuable thing he had learned from building the cleaning company was that most people underestimated the cost of not planning. He said companies failed not because bad things happened, bad things always happened, but because people had not thought carefully about what they would do when bad things happened. And so when bad things happened, they panicked, and panic was expensive. I asked him what he meant. He said, "Every decision you make in panic costs twice what it would have cost if you made it calmly. Sometimes 3 times. Sometimes you don't get to recover." He had also given me an understanding of how he thought about fairness. He did not believe in equal distribution as an automatic virtue. He believed in considered distribution. He would say that giving everyone the same thing regardless of their relationship to what was being given was not fairness, but laziness dressed up as principle. He watched, he remembered, and when it was time to decide, he decided. The house on Millbrook Road had been in his name since 1971. He had made the down payment with money he had saved for 11 years. He had fixed the roof himself the first time it needed fixing, with the help of a neighbor and a rented scaffolding system and 2 weekends of labor. He had planted the garden in the first spring and maintained it for 53 years. He told me once that when he bought the house, he drove out to look at it alone, before the closing, on an early morning in February when the light was flat and the trees were bare, and you could see exactly what the structure was without anything decorative to soften it. He said he stood in the driveway for a long time and asked himself, "Is this worth everything it will cost? Is this a thing worth building a life around?" He had decided yes. That was the foundation of everything that followed. The Tuesday evenings with Grandpa were something I had not told my father about in any detail. Not because I was secretive, but because they were private in the way that some relationships are private, not hidden, just not meant for general circulation. My father knew I called Grandpa regularly. He didn't know what we talked about, what Grandpa told me, what I carried away from those conversations. He didn't know, for instance, that Grandpa had once told me exactly how much he had made from the sale of the company. He didn't share this casually. He told me during a conversation about something else entirely, slipping it in the way he slipped in most of the important things, as if it were a small note he was leaving on a table for me to find. He said, "When I sold in '95, the number surprised even me. I had not been counting carefully. You shouldn't count too carefully. It makes you start to think the number is the point." I asked him what the point was. He thought about it for longer than I expected. "The point," he said, "is that you're still here at 64 and the people you built it with are mostly still healthy, and the number means you'll never have to ask anyone for anything. That's the point. The number is how you keep score, but it's not what you were playing for." I wrote that down when I got home. I have it still, in a notebook I have kept since I was 20, full of things Grandpa said on Tuesday evenings that I wanted to remember. He said other things too. He said that most people made decisions out of fear and called it caution. He said that the difference between patience and passivity was whether you were waiting for something or waiting instead of doing something. He said that the hardest thing in any family was to love the people in it clearly, to see them as they were, not as you needed them to be, and to keep loving them anyway, even when what you saw was disappointing. I think he was talking, in that last observation, about his sons. I don't think he was sad about it. He was too clear-eyed for sadness that simple. He understood that people became what they became through a combination of nature and circumstance and the small daily decisions that accumulate over a lifetime, and he did not believe in blaming anyone for what they had become. But he also did not believe in pretending that what they had become was something it wasn't. He saw my father clearly. He loved my father anyway. He made his decisions accordingly. This, I came to understand, was the fullest expression of how Grandpa operated. He held both things at once: love and clarity, warmth and precision, patience and the willingness to act when the moment came. He had been waiting for the moment. He recognized it when it arrived. The shift started small. Most shifts do. The summer I turned 24, my Uncle Dennis began mentioning estate planning at family gatherings. Not in an alarming way, not in the way that would have made Grandpa look up sharply from his chair. Dennis was subtler than that. He would mention articles he'd read, friends whose parents had left complicated estates, the cost and difficulty of probate for families who hadn't planned carefully. Grandpa would listen and nod and say very little. He had a way of doing that, receiving information without reacting to it, storing it somewhere behind his eyes where you couldn't quite see what he thought of it yet. I recognized that expression because I had the same one. My mother told me once that I had Grandpa's face, and she didn't mean it entirely as a compliment, because Grandpa's face had a way of telling you nothing until he was ready. The summer after that, the summer I was 25, the conversations became more pointed. My father began joining them. Dad and Dennis together, I came to understand, were more effective than either one separately. Dennis was the reasonable one, practical, measured, full of useful information about tax implications and estate costs and the value of simplicity. My father was the emotional one, concerned, loving, worried about Grandpa's future, anxious about what would happen to the house, to everything Grandpa had built if it wasn't organized properly. They were a good team. I don't think they planned it explicitly, but people who want the same thing often find a rhythm without needing to discuss the choreography. Grandpa was 81 that summer. He was still sharp. He still drove himself to the grocery store on Tuesdays and to church on Sundays. He still read the newspaper every morning and did the crossword most evenings and called me on Tuesday nights. But he was 81, and some of his closest friends were dying. And the house felt larger every year, and the garden smaller, and some Tuesdays he told me he missed Ruth in a way that still surprised him, like putting your hand out for something that should be there and finding air. I think my father and uncle knew that. I think they understood the particular vulnerability of someone who is still sharp enough to understand their own situation, but old enough to want peace, to want things settled, to not want conflict. The conversations happened primarily on Sunday afternoons when I wasn't there. My parents would visit Grandpa after church, and Dennis and Patris would sometimes come too, and they would have lunch and talk, and on Tuesday nights when Grandpa called me, he would mention these conversations in the way you mention something you're still turning over. "Your father thinks I should consolidate," he told me once. "Consolidate what?" I asked. "The property holdings, the accounts, into a single trust structure," he says, "simpler for everyone when the time comes." "What do you think?" I asked. A pause. Then, "I think your father and your uncle have been thinking about this for longer than they're letting on." I said nothing. He said nothing. We talked about something else. But I remembered it. In October of the year I turned 25, something happened that I didn't find out about until 2 months later. My grandfather signed a document. It was a trust amendment, a modification to the existing revocable trust he had set up years earlier, with the guidance of Gerald Foss. The amendment restructured the distribution of the estate. Under the original trust, the estate was to be distributed in equal shares, one portion to my father, one to Dennis, and one held in trust for me until I reached 30. Under the amendment, the distribution changed. The house, a 4-bedroom colonial on 2 acres that Grandpa had bought in 1971 and paid off by 1988, transferred directly to my father and uncle as joint tenants upon Grandpa's death. The investment accounts, which had been carefully managed for decades, and had reached a value my grandfather mentioned to me only once, in passing, as enough to matter, were to be divided equally between my father and Dennis. The cash accounts and personal property went into a general estate pool. My name appeared once in the document, in a line that said the granddaughter, Vivienne Caldwell, would receive personal property items designated by the decedent during his lifetime. Personal property items. Not a third, not the amount Grandpa had always spoken of. Personal property items, the books he'd said I could have, the photographs, the small carved wooden box that had belonged to his mother. I found out because Grandpa told me. He called on a Tuesday evening in early December, not the usual Tuesday, a different one, and his voice had something in it I hadn't heard before. Not distress exactly, something more like decision. "I need you to come on Saturday," he said. "In the morning, early." I drove the 40 minutes on Saturday morning with a thermos of coffee and arrived at his house at 8 o'clock. He was already at the kitchen table with 2 cups and a folder. He pushed the folder across the table and asked me to read it. I read it. When I looked up, he was watching my face. "They had a lawyer prepare it," he said. "Not Gerald, someone else, a man named Franklin from an office downtown." He paused. "They came to me in October together. Dennis brought the document. Your father brought the lunch." "Did you understand what you were signing?" I asked. I asked it directly because I needed to know. "Yes," he said. "I understood." I waited. "I signed it," he said, "because I wanted to see what would happen next." That was the moment I understood that my grandfather was not confused, not manipulated, not vulnerable in the way my father and uncle had perhaps believed. He was watching. He had been watching, and he had made a decision to let them think they had won because he already knew what he was going to do next. "I have an appointment with Gerald on Monday," he said. He slid a second piece of paper across the table. It was a handwritten outline, his handwriting, careful and precise, of what he wanted the codicil to say. The trust amendment my father and uncle brought was thorough. Whoever they had hired, the lawyer named Franklin, was competent. The document was precisely worded. It would have held up in the ordinary course of things without challenge. The thing about estate law that most people don't understand until they need to is that a valid document is only as stable as the absence of a better document. If 2 documents conflict, the later document generally governs. And Grandpa understood this completely. "Read it," he said, "and don't tell anyone, not yet." I read it. Then I looked up at him, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. "Wait until the room is full," he said. I want to be honest about what those 8 months were like. They were not easy. I am not someone who carries deception lightly. That is not how I am built. I had grown up in a family where I generally said what I thought and expected the same from the people around me, and discovering that the people around me were not operating on those same terms was its own kind of education. Christmas happened 6 weeks after I sat at Grandpa's kitchen table and read the codicil outline. We gathered at my parents' house, my parents, me, Dennis, and Patris, their son Marcus and his wife. Grandpa came, the way he always came, sitting in the chair near the window that had always been his chair since I could remember. My father was warm with him, attentive, helpful. He brought Grandpa a plate without being asked and refilled his coffee twice and sat near him during the gift opening and laughed at his stories with what appeared to be genuine warmth. I watched and said nothing. There was a period, approximately 4 months into the 8 months, when keeping the secret became genuinely hard. Not because I was tempted to break it, I was not tempted to break it. I had made a promise, and I intended to keep it. But the keeping of it had a cost that I had not fully anticipated, and I want to name that cost because I think it is part of the story. The cost was in the uncertainty. I knew what the codicil said. I had read the outline, but I could not know with certainty that nothing would change. Grandpa was 81. He was in reasonable health, but he was 81, and 81 is old, and old is unpredictable. I spent months watching my father make phone calls, watching my Uncle Dennis bring printouts to Sunday dinners, watching the wheels of a plan that assumed a particular outcome turn steadily toward a day that had already been privately decided against. During those 8 months, I kept a private notebook. I didn't write about the codicil directly. I didn't write anything that could be found and read and understood. But I wrote about other things, observations about my grandfather, memories of Tuesday evening conversations, small details I wanted to keep before they faded. The way he always had 2 cups ready when you arrived. The way he stored the newspaper articles he'd saved for me in a manila folder labeled with the month, 4 years of monthly folders, organized in a drawer in the kitchen. He was keeping me company in the specific way of someone who knows you are carrying something and cannot take it from you, but can stand close enough that you don't have to carry it alone. He died in March. On a Sunday morning, quietly, in his own bed in the house he had lived in since 1971. His neighbor found him when he didn't wave on his Tuesday grocery run. Grandpa had always waved to this neighbor on his way to the car, and when he didn't wave, the neighbor came to check, and that was how it happened. He was 82 years old. The will reading was scheduled 5 weeks later. My father called me the evening after the funeral to talk about logistics. His voice was careful and kind. He mentioned that Gerald Foss would be conducting the reading and that it would be good to have things handled efficiently. He mentioned the house, what it might be worth, what sense it made to sell it sooner rather than later, how the market was. I said I understood. I did understand. I understood very clearly. I want to tell you about those 8 months in more detail, because I think they matter to understanding what happened. The thing about keeping a secret from your family is that it changes the texture of ordinary moments. Thanksgiving, for instance. We gathered at my parents' house that year, the first full family gathering after I had read the Codicil outline. My father was at the head of the table. Dennis was across from me. Patris was talking about something she had read about a state organization, a piece of advice she'd seen somewhere. I don't remember exactly what it was, but the content was familiar. I ate my food and listened. My father looked comfortable, settled in the way of a man who believes a problem has been resolved. He was funny at the table that year, more relaxed than he'd been in months, I thought. He told a story about something that had happened at work. He laughed at Dennis's joke. He refilled everyone's glasses before they needed refilling. I watched him and felt something that I have not fully named, even now. It was not anger. It was not contempt. It was something more like grief for the version of my father I had believed him to be before I understood what he had done, and something like sorrow that the two versions could not somehow be reconciled into one man I could hold without complication. He was my father. I loved him. He had done something that I could not excuse, regardless of how I understood it. Those two things sat side by side in me through every family gathering for 8 months, and I learned to carry them without letting either one tip over. Grandpa called me the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. "How was it?" he asked. "Fine," I said. "Good food." A pause, then. "Your father seemed well." "He did." "He's a man who likes things settled," Grandpa said. "He always has been. When he was small, he used to straighten everything on his dresser before he could sleep. Every night. Everything in its exact place." He said this not unkindly. He said it the way you describe someone you understand completely, even the parts that have caused you trouble. "And you," I said. "Me," a pause. "I am also a man who likes things settled. We are alike in that." Another pause. "We simply disagree about what settling looks like." I thought about that long after we hung up. I want to pause here for a moment and ask you something. Has someone in your life ever trusted you with a secret so important that keeping it took everything you had, and you were the only one who knew how hard that silence was? Leave a comment and tell me. I read every single one. And if this story is keeping you here, please subscribe and hit the bell. I put a new story up every week. Now let's go back to Thursday morning. The night before the will reading, I drove to Grandpa's house. The key was still on my keyring. He had given it to me years ago, and I had never given it back, and he had never asked for it. I let myself in through the back door, the way I always had. The house was dark and quiet in the way that houses become after the person who lived in them is gone, not empty exactly, but stilled. The dishes were still in the drying rack from his last morning. A book was open on the table beside his chair, face down, the way he always left books when he meant to come back. I sat in his chair for a while. I wasn't afraid of the next morning. That surprised me a little. I had expected to feel more nervous. But sitting in that chair, in that house, I felt something closer to settled, like standing on ground that has already proven it can hold your weight. Grandpa had been specific about what he wanted. Gerald Foss had those documents. They were legal and witnessed and signed, not by a stranger in a downtown office who had been hired for one purpose, but by Gerald Foss, who had known Harold Caldwell for 22 years. I picked up the book he'd left open. It was a biography of a civil engineer, someone who had built bridges in difficult terrain in the early 20th century. Grandpa had a pattern of reading about people who built things that lasted. I put it back, face down, the way he'd left it. I turned off the lights and went home. The conference room at Gerald Foss's office was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown. Wood-paneled walls, a long table, chairs with armrests, water glasses already filled when we arrived. My parents arrived together. My Uncle Dennis arrived with Patris. I came alone. We settled into seats. Gerald's assistant closed the door. Gerald opened the folder. He read the primary document first, the trust amendment, the one my father and Dennis had brought to Grandpa with the lawyer named Franklin. He read it steadily and without expression. My father listened with his hands folded on the table. My Uncle Dennis sat back slightly in his chair with the posture of a man who expects to hear something that confirms what he already knows. My mother had a notepad in front of her, though she hadn't written anything on it. Gerald finished the primary document. He set it aside. He reached into the folder. "There is also," he said, "a codicil." The room changed. It didn't make a sound. No one gasped. No one moved. But something in the air of the room shifted the way air shifts before weather. My mother's hand went to her chest. My father's eyes moved to Gerald's face. My Uncle Dennis sat forward slowly, the casual posture gone. "A codicil," my father said. "Yes," Gerald said. "Executed in October, 2 weeks after the trust amendment, witnessed and notarized in this office." A pause. "Mr. Caldwell contacted me directly following the amendment," Gerald continued. "He came in alone. He had a clear idea of what he wanted to add." Gerald read the codicil. It was not long. Grandpa Harold had been a man who said what he meant and did not use more words than necessary. The codicil addressed 3 things. First, the house. The trust amendment had transferred the house to my father and uncle as joint tenants. The codicil established a life estate, a provision that said the house could not be sold, transferred, or modified in any way for a period of 3 years following Harold Caldwell's death. During those 3 years, the house was to remain in the estate, with all taxes and maintenance costs paid from estate funds. At the end of the 3-year period, the house would be offered to Vivienne Caldwell at fair market value, with first right of refusal and a purchase option at 15% below assessed value. My father's jaw tightened. Second, the investment accounts. The trust amendment had divided these equally between my father and Dennis. The codicil established a separate account, one that Grandpa had opened quietly, moved funds into gradually over the previous 2 years, and designated exclusively to Vivienne Caldwell, to be transferred in full upon his death. The value of this account, Gerald said, was $412,000. My mother made a small sound. Third, a letter. Grandpa had left a sealed letter to be read aloud at this meeting by Gerald Foss. Gerald opened a second envelope and read it. It was very much a Harold Caldwell letter, measured, clear, without performance. He wrote that he loved his sons. He wrote that he had spent his life working to build something that would last, and that he had watched carefully in his final years to understand how that something would be treated when he was gone. He wrote that what he observed had informed his decisions. He wrote, "I have 2 sons who are good men. I believe this without reservation. I have also, in these last years, observed that my sons have become more interested in what I own than in who I am. This is a natural thing. It is a thing that happens in families. It is not something I hold against them. But it has been my experience in 6 decades of watching people that the surest indicator of how someone will treat a thing is how they treat the person it belonged to while that person is still alive." He wrote that his granddaughter Vivienne had called him on Tuesday evenings, for years without wanting anything from him, that he couldn't give her freely. He wrote that when he had shown her a document in December, a document that told her exactly what she stood to gain. She had read it and said nothing to anyone because he had asked her not to. He wrote, "She kept the secret not because she was calculating, but because I asked her to trust me, and she trusted me. That is the kind of thing I have never been able to buy and have spent my life trying to deserve." He wrote that he hoped his sons would understand his decisions in time, and that he hoped the passage of years would allow for the restoration of something that felt right between all the people in this room. He signed it, Harold James Caldwell. Below his signature, in parentheses in his handwriting, "Your father, your grandfather, take your pick." Gerald folded the letter. He set it on the table. No one spoke for a long moment. Then my father said, in a voice that was very quiet, "He planned this." "Yes," I said. It was the first thing I had said in the room. "He planned it very carefully." My father spoke first after the silence broke. He said he wanted to contest the codicil. He said it was clear that Grandpa had been influenced. He said the timing, 2 weeks after the amendment, suggested something had happened to change his mind, and he wanted to know what. Gerald Foss looked at him steadily. "Your father came to me alone," Gerald said. "He was, as he had always been in my experience, entirely clear in his thinking and his intentions. He brought written notes of what he wanted the codicil to say. He answered every question I asked him about his reasoning. The document was witnessed by 2 members of my staff who had no relationship to the beneficiaries." Gerald paused. "I've been practicing estate law for 38 years. I would not have executed this document if I had any question about your father's capacity or intent." My father said nothing. My Uncle Dennis put his hand on the table and then took it off again. My mother had stopped writing on her notepad. She was looking at me. I looked back. I kept my face the way Grandpa had taught me, receiving information without reacting, storing it behind my eyes. The call with my father, later that week, lasted 47 minutes. He cycled through several different versions of the same argument, each one slightly reframed, each one a new attempt to find the angle that would make me agree with him. First, he argued that Grandpa had been manipulated. When I did not agree with that, he argued that I had been complicit in something unfair to him and Dennis. When I did not agree with that, he argued that family harmony mattered more than legal documents. I said, "It did stay in the family." He did not say anything for a moment. "He always liked you best," he said finally, quietly. I thought about that for a long time afterward, not because it stung, but because I didn't think it was accurate and I wanted to understand what my father believed. I don't think Grandpa liked me best. I think Grandpa trusted me with something, and I honored that trust, and he remembered it. I think he extended that same trust to everyone who came close to him in the right way, and some people were paying attention, and some people were not. My father was paying attention to the wrong thing. The 3-year restriction on the house ends next spring. I have been saving since the will reading. I have a number in mind and a mortgage pre-approval and an appointment with a contractor who specializes in older homes. The contractor's name was Raymond. I noticed this and thought about it for a moment. Grandpa's middle name was Raymond, Harold Raymond Caldwell. He walked through every room with a notepad and a flashlight and told me what he found. The foundation was in excellent condition. The roof had been replaced in 2019. Grandpa had apparently arranged it quietly, without mentioning it to anyone. The electrical system needed updating in 2 rooms. None of it was impossible. All of it was manageable. I stood in the kitchen while the contractor made his notes and looked at the table where Grandpa and I had sat in December, with the folder and the coffee and the outline of what he wanted the codicil to say. The table was still there. His chair was still there. Grandpa's neighbor June came to the door that same afternoon. She had lived next door for 27 years. She was the person Grandpa had called when the water heater made a strange noise at 11 o'clock at night. The person he borrowed a ladder from and returned it with a jar of strawberry preserves from the garden. She asked me what was going to happen to the house. I told her I was planning to buy it. She nodded slowly, the way you nod when something makes sense. He talked about you, she said. On Tuesdays, sometimes when he came back from his grocery run, he talked about his granddaughter. She paused. He said you were the one who paid attention. I did not say anything for a moment. He was the one who paid attention, I said. He taught me. She looked at the house, then back at me. He'll be glad it's you, she said, and she went back inside. I stood in the driveway for a moment. The trees were different now. It was spring, and the bare lines of winter had filled in, and the whole driveway was softened by leaves. I stood there and thought about a man who paid attention to everything he loved, and who built things to last, and who trusted the right person with the thing he had built. I thought, I will take care of it. I thought, I will not let it go to waste. I thought, Tuesday evenings always. Then I went inside and kept working. The money from the separate account has been carefully managed. I consulted a financial advisor the month after the reading, someone Gerald Foss recommended, someone with no connection to my parents or my uncle. I made decisions that felt right to me. Some of them Grandpa would have approved of immediately. Some of them I think he would have asked about, turned over, examined from a few angles before saying what he thought. I miss those conversations. I miss having someone to call on Tuesday evenings who would ask good questions and wait to hear the whole answer before saying anything. I have been building, slowly, a different version of that, a collection of people I can call, a network of conversations that sustain me. It is not the same as one person who has known you for decades and paid attention the whole time, but it is something. It is the kind of structure you build when you understand that no single element holds everything, but that together, if you choose carefully, they can. My relationship with my parents continues to evolve. My mother and I are closer than we were in the months after the reading. She came to visit in the fall, the first time we had spent a day together, just the two of us, since before the will reading. We went to a garden center and she helped me choose plants for the front of the Millbrook Road house, for when it's mine. She knows plants in a way I don't. She has a particular gift for understanding what will thrive in a given soil and light. We didn't talk about the codicil that day. We talked about plants and about a trip she was planning and about a book she had read that she thought I would like. At one point, in the parking lot of the garden center, she stopped and looked at me and said, "He loved you very much." "I know," I said. "I think I was jealous of it," she said. "When you were young, the way he looked at you, I don't think I was wrong to notice it." "No," I said, "you weren't wrong." She nodded. Then she picked up a flat of lavender and carried it to the car. That was all. It was not a resolution, but it was something. The lavender is growing now, in a pot on my apartment balcony. I'm waiting for the house before I plant it in the ground. It deserves to be in the ground, in the right soil, where it can really take hold. I will plant it in the spring. Grandpa would have approved of that plan. He understood the value of planting things in the right place at the right time. He understood the value of waiting until the conditions were right and then committing fully. He built things to last. So will I. My parents had been married for 34 years by the time of the will reading. This is relevant because I want you to understand who they were before I tell you what they did. They were not simply villains. They were people who had spent 34 years building a life together and who had made, in their later years, a set of calculations about what that life would look like as it moved toward its final chapters. My father had worked for the same company for 29 years. He was a project manager, someone who coordinated large systems, kept things on schedule, anticipated problems before they became emergencies. He was good at his job in the way that people are good at things that suit their fundamental nature. He liked order. He liked knowing where things stood. He liked, as Grandpa had said, things settled. My mother was a person of deep feeling who had learned, over decades of marriage to a man who valued order, to contain her feelings in practical containers. She expressed love through logistics, meals and appointments and things arranged before you knew you needed them arranged. She had a gift for anticipating need and meeting it before it was articulated. This was her form of warmth, and it was real warmth, even if it didn't always look the way warmth is supposed to look. They were, together, a particular kind of unit, efficient, forward planning, oriented toward stability. They were the kind of couple who had discussed their retirement extensively, who had spreadsheets for their savings and projected timelines for their mortgage, who knew exactly what they were building toward and had been building toward it for a long time. Grandpa's estate was part of what they were building toward. I don't think they knew exactly how much, but they knew it was significant. And I think the certainty of it, the sense that it was coming, that it was theirs, had become woven into their projections somewhere along the way. I understood this. I had grown up in that house, with those parents, absorbing without quite knowing I was absorbing it the particular arithmetic of a family that was always quietly counting something. I did not blame them for counting. I blamed them, if I blamed them at all, for going to Grandpa and asking him to help them count faster. The handwritten outline Grandpa showed me at the kitchen table in December covered a single sheet of cream paper in his careful, precise handwriting. The handwriting of a man who had written estimates and invoices and contracts for 30 years and had never trusted illegibility. He had written 5 items. The first was the life estate provision, the restriction on the house for 3 years, followed by my option to purchase at below market value. He had calculated the number himself, based on the county assessment, and a current market estimate he had requested from a real estate agent he'd called without telling my father. The second was the separate account, the investment account he had been quietly building for 2 years. He had opened it at a different institution than his primary accounts, in my name as sole beneficiary, and had transferred funds into it gradually enough not to attract attention. He told me, at that kitchen table, that the balance would be somewhere between $350,000 and $450,000 by the time of the reading, depending on the market. The third was a clause specifying that if either of his sons chose to contest the codicil, they would forfeit their shares under the original trust amendment as well. A provision Gerald had advised him he could include, and which would make a legal challenge extremely costly and unlikely to succeed. The fourth was the letter he wanted Gerald to read aloud. The fifth item on the list was short. It was a single sentence, written at the bottom of the page in slightly heavier ink, as if he had pressed harder when he wrote it. It said, "Make sure she knows I was proud of her." I read it at the kitchen table. I looked up at him. He was watching my face. He said, "I'm telling you now, in case Gerald forgets to make it sufficiently clear." I did not say anything for a long moment. Then I said, "He won't forget." "No," he said, "but I wanted you to hear it directly." We sat at that table for another hour, drinking coffee that went cold while we talked about other things. His plans for the garden in the spring, a book he was reading, a news story he'd found irritating. Ordinary Tuesday morning things. When I left, he walked me to the back door. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm not worried," I said. "Good," he said. "There's nothing to worry about, it's all in order." He said it the way he said everything important, calmly, without performance, as a simple statement of fact. Then he went back inside, and I drove the 40 minutes home with the outline of a codicil in my memory and the specific weight of a secret that was also, somehow, a gift. Gerald Foss had been practicing estate law since before I was born. He had, over 38 years, sat in rooms like this one with every configuration of family that grief and money and legal documents could produce. He had learned to read rooms quickly, not with drama, but with the quiet attention of someone who understood that what people said in these moments was often less accurate than how they sat, where they looked, what they did with their hands. He had met my grandfather in 1985, the year Harold Caldwell had decided to formalize his estate planning. They had met twice a year, roughly, since then. Gerald had drafted the original trust. He had updated it after Grandma Ruth died. He had updated it again when Grandpa turned 75 and wanted to ensure that certain specific items went to specific people. He had, 2 weeks after the trust amendment, received a phone call from Harold Caldwell requesting an appointment. Gerald had told me, privately, that he had known from the moment he received that call why it was happening. He said he had worked with Harold long enough to recognize the difference between a man who needed something organized and a man who had already organized it and wanted the legal structure to match. "He came in with a folder," Gerald said. "Yellow legal pad, everything written out in his handwriting. Every provision, every detail, the specific wording he wanted for the restriction clause. I've had clients bring notes before. I've never had a client bring a complete draft." "He liked things orderly," I said. "He was the most orderly man I've ever represented," Gerald said, "in 38 years. He said this with something that sounded, across the careful professional distance of an attorney, like affection. My Uncle Dennis, in the conference room, had the face of a man who was doing rapid calculations. He was not the type to make dramatic gestures. He was practical, as I have said, and practical men do not throw scenes in conference rooms. But his calculation was visible in the stillness of him, in the way his eyes moved between Gerald's face and the documents on the table, and once, briefly, to me. He looked at me for 1 second, then he looked away. I do not know what he was thinking. I have my guesses. I think he was asking himself how long I had known, whether he should have seen it coming, what it meant that Grandpa had chosen to tell me and not him. I think he was also, somewhere underneath the calculation, sad in a way he would not have admitted, sad about his father, about the distance between what he had expected and what had turned out to be true. I felt, in that second of eye contact, something more complicated than triumph. I felt the weight of what had been decided, and by whom, and what it would mean going forward. Not for me specifically, I knew what it meant for me, but for the room, for the family, for the specific shape of the relationships between all the people in it. Grandpa had decided correctly. I believed that then, and I believe it now. But correct decisions can still be costly. They can still change things in ways that take years to understand. In the 14 months since the will reading, I have made several decisions that I want to tell you about, because I think they matter to the shape of the story. I hired a financial advisor. I took a careful look at what I had been left and what I owed and what I needed and what I wanted. I spent several weeks thinking before I made any decisions. This was deliberate. I had seen what happened when people made financial decisions quickly, under pressure or excitement, and I had decided that this was not how I would operate. I paid off my student loans. This was not the most financially optimal decision, according to the advisor. He suggested other uses of the capital that would have generated better returns. But I had carried that debt for 6 years, and I wanted it gone. Some decisions are about math, and some decisions are about the specific relief of setting something down. I made the second kind of decision. I set aside a portion for the house. I have a number in mind, and I have been disciplined about it, not adding to it unnecessarily, not using it for anything else, holding it specifically for the purchase that will happen next spring. The rest I have invested, carefully, in the way Grandpa would have recognized. Diversified, patient, oriented toward the long term. I don't look at it often. I know it's there. I don't think about it as a number so much as a fact about what is possible, a foundation, in the specific way Grandpa used that word, that determines what can be built above it. I have also done something that was not financial. I have started learning the garden. Not in a formal way. I haven't taken classes or bought books or subscribed to anything. I have simply been going to the house on weekends and spending time in the garden and learning what's there by being present with it. What comes back every spring? What died and needs to be replaced? Where the soil is good and where it needs attention. Grandpa's garden was his for 53 years. It will need time to become mine, to learn my habits, my attentions, my particular way of noticing what it needs. I am giving it that time. I am being patient with it the way Grandpa was patient with everything worth having. There is a bed of irises along the back fence that I did not expect. I found them in May, coming up without any help from me, purple and white, exactly where Grandpa had apparently planted them years ago. I stood and looked at them for a long time. I don't know when he planted them. He never mentioned them to me. But they were there, thriving, because he had put them in the ground at some point and tended them, and they had become, over time, something that didn't need him anymore. Something that would keep coming back on its own. I took a photograph of them and kept it. I will plant more in the fall. I stayed in the house for almost 2 hours that night. I walked through every room with the lights off, using only the light from the windows. The streetlight on Millbrook Road throws a soft amber glow into the front rooms, and the back of the house catches moonlight when the sky is clear, and it was clear that night in April with a moon just past full. I had grown up visiting this house. I had spent weekends here as a child, summers here as a teenager, Tuesday mornings here as an adult. I knew which floorboard in the upstairs hallway creaked on the left side and was silent on the right. I knew that the third drawer in the kitchen stuck in humid weather and had to be lifted slightly to open. I knew that the window in the back bedroom faced northeast and was the first in the house to catch morning light. I knew this house the way you know a person you have spent decades paying attention to. I stood in the back bedroom for a while, looking out the window at the garden in the dark. The irises I would find in May were not yet up. It was April, still cool, the garden not yet showing what it held. I thought about Grandpa planting things. I thought about the specific act of putting something in the ground knowing you might not see it come up, or might see it come up only a few more times, or might never know what it became after you were gone. The faith involved in that, not religious faith exactly, but the structural faith of a man who believed that what you tended carefully enough would outlast you. He had tended me carefully enough. I hoped I would outlast him in the right way, not just in the obvious biological sense, in the more important sense of carrying something forward that he had built, an understanding, a way of paying attention, a belief in the value of things that take a long time and require consistency, and do not announce themselves dramatically but simply, when the right moment comes, hold. I went back downstairs and sat in his chair one more time. The book was still on the table, face down. I picked it up and read a few pages in the amber streetlight. The bridge engineer was discussing a problem of foundation soil, the difficulty of building on ground that appeared stable but had properties that made it unpredictable under load. The engineer's solution was characteristically patient. He tested the soil extensively before committing to a design, and then he designed a foundation deep enough that the unpredictable upper layers didn't matter. He went down past them, to the bedrock, and built from there. I put the book back. I thought, that's what Grandpa did. He went past the unpredictable upper layers. He found something solid and built from there. He found it in me, or I found it in him, or we found it together over years of Tuesday evenings. I'm not sure the direction matters. What matters is that it was there. Solid, bedrock. He built on it. I intend to build on it too. Grandpa had a theory about families that he articulated clearly only once, in a Tuesday evening conversation when I was 23. He said that every family had, underneath all the surface arrangements of who called whom, and who showed up for what and who remembered whose birthday, a deeper structure of who actually saw whom. Seeing, he said, is different from knowing. You can know a person for 40 years and still not see them. You can have dinner with someone every week for decades and never look up from your plate long enough to understand who's actually sitting across from you. I asked him what he meant by seeing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, noticing what someone is actually like, not what you need them to be, not what they've always been, not what it would be convenient for them to be, what they actually are right now today. He said that most families were organized around what people needed each other to be rather than what they actually were, and that this worked well enough until a moment of pressure came, a death, a will, a legal document, and then the gap between the two became impossible to ignore. He said, the families that hold together through those moments are the ones where someone was actually paying attention. I have thought about this often in the 14 months since the reading. I think he was right. I think the families that fracture under pressure are not fracturing because of the pressure. They are fracturing because the pressure reveals something that was always there, a structural fault that had been papered over by the ordinary business of getting through days and years without looking too closely. Our family has faults. I see them clearly now in the way you see a crack in a wall after the paint has been stripped, not a new damage but an old one, finally visible. I do not know if those cracks can be repaired. I think some of them can. I think my mother and I are doing the slow work of repairing something, one garden center visit at a time, one honest sentence at a time. I think my father and I may, eventually, do the same, may find our way back to something that is not what it was before but is its own new structure, built with the understanding of what happened and why. Or we may not. I hold both possibilities without choosing between them yet. It is too early to know. What I know is that Grandpa saw me, and that I saw him, and that the thing we built together over years of Tuesday evenings was solid enough to hold under the pressure that came. That is what he left me. Not just the house, not just the account, not just the codicil in its sealed envelope. He left me the understanding of what it means to actually see someone, to pay attention long enough that you understand them. To build something with that understanding, carefully, over time, in the faith that it will matter when it needs to matter. I intend to practice this for the rest of my life. I intend to be the kind of person who pays attention. He taught me how. The last time I saw Grandpa before he died was a Sunday in late February. He had called on the previous Tuesday to ask if I could come that Sunday. Not the usual time, he said, but he wanted to show me something in the garden. I drove out on Sunday morning with the thermos of coffee I always brought when I came in the morning, and he was already outside when I arrived, standing at the back fence in his coat and his good boots, looking at something I couldn't see from the driveway. I walked back to him. He was looking at a patch of ground near the fence where nothing was visible yet, just winter soil, dry and flat, with no indication of what was under it. "Right here," he said, when I came to stand beside him. "What's here?" I said. "Irises," he said. "I put them in 3 autumns ago. They came up the first 2 springs. They'll come up again." He said it with the quiet certainty of someone who has planted enough things to know what comes back. We stood there for a few minutes, looking at the ground, drinking our coffee. It was cold and bright, with that particular February quality of light that is sharp without being warm. You can see everything clearly, but you can't quite feel it yet. He said, without looking at me, "You'll take care of this place." It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "Good," he said. We went inside and had coffee at the kitchen table and talked about the news and a book he was reading and a memory he had of a similar February morning when he and Ruth had stood in almost the same spot looking at almost the same patch of ground, waiting for something to come up. "She loved irises," he said. "I know," I said. "You've told me." "I keep telling you," he said, "because I keep wanting you to know." He died 4 weeks later. The irises came up in May, exactly where he had shown me. Purple and white, tall and steady, exactly as he said they would be. I stood in front of them for a long time. Then I went inside and sat at the kitchen table and had a cup of coffee. It was a Tuesday. Grandpa Harold used to say that the best structures are the ones that take the longest to build, because by the time they're standing, every piece has been tested. He built his cleaning company over 31 years. He built his marriage to Ruth over 42 years. He built his estate over a lifetime, and then, quietly, in the last years of it, he made sure the right pieces were in the right places for the right reasons. People sometimes ask me, after I have told some version of this story in pieces, to people I trust enough to tell, why I called him on Tuesday evenings. Why Tuesdays specifically? The honest answer is that I don't know how it became Tuesdays. It was one of those things that settled into place without being decided. Somewhere in my late teens or early 20s, Tuesday evenings became the seam in the week, the pause between the first half and the second half, the moment when I had finished enough to be present. Grandpa, when I asked him once if he was busy on Tuesdays, said, "I am usually free on Tuesdays. Tuesday is when I have time to think." We had not established a schedule. We did not confirm a time. But after a while, if I didn't call on Tuesday, he would call me, not to ask why I hadn't called, just to talk, as if the Tuesday connection had become its own kind of structure, its own load-bearing wall. I think of Tuesday evenings now as one of the great gifts of my life, not because of anything dramatic that happened during them. Because of what they built, conversation by conversation, The way you build any structure worth having, slowly, with attention, with the understanding that the value is not in any single element, but in the thing all the elements become together. He gave me those conversations freely. He gave me the codicil because of those conversations. I cannot separate the two. I cannot say the inheritance matters more than the evenings, or that the evenings mattered more than the inheritance. They are the same thing. They are what he built for me, over years, on Tuesday nights, in the specific and irreplaceable way that one person builds something in another person by being present and paying attention and staying on the line. I drove past his house last week. The garden is not as tidy as Grandpa kept it. I have been there on weekends when I can manage it, pulling what needs to be pulled, cutting back what has grown beyond its borders. But the structure itself is solid. The foundation, the walls, the roof, they've held through everything. Grandpa made sure of that. Grandpa always made sure of that. He built things to last. And he made sure that the person he trusted to take care of them was someone who understood why that mattered. I hope, wherever he is, he knows that I understand. I hope he knows that I always did. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this one. I'll be here every week, same channel, same promise. This is Signed and Silent. Good night.